The seventh plate. Eleanor Whitaker set the seventh plate on the dining room table and stood over it long enough for the gravy to begin boiling over on the stove. The sound reached her before the smell did, a wet hiss under the low murmur of the football game coming from the living room. She turned too quickly, bumped her hip against the corner of the table, and caught the back of the nearest chair to steady herself. The plate did not move. It sat there between the folded napkin and the water glass, white with a blue rim, the same kind she had used for more Thanksgivings than she cared to count, 7 places. She had only needed 6. Eleanor was 69 years old enough to measure a holiday by what could go wrong before noon. The turkey had gone in on time, the rolls were wrapped in foil, the green beans were still too firm, but Margaret liked them that way, and Margaret was the kind of daughter who noticed if vegetables had crossed from crisp into soft. Robert had taken his medicine after breakfast without being reminded. Thomas had texted that he was 10 minutes out. Margaret and her husband were bringing Tommy, who was 6 now and old enough to ask questions before adults could decide whether they wanted to answer. And David was not coming. David had not come for 20 years. He was 32 now, though Eleanor still had to correct herself sometimes. In her mind, the number stopped at 12 if she was not careful. 12 was the age he had been when he left this house with a backpack, a sketchbook, and whatever small bills he had managed to find. 12 was the age on the first missing person report. 12 was the age that made people lower their voices when they asked questions, at least in the beginning. No one lowered their voice anymore. That was part of the problem. The gravy hissed again, sharper this time, and Eleanor hurried back into the kitchen. She moved the saucepan off the burner and wiped the spill with a dishcloth, making small, fast circles as if the stove had personally embarrassed her. From the living room, the announcer's voice rose over a replay. "Everything all right in there?" Robert called. His voice was not loud. That still caught her sometimes. For the first 25 years of their marriage, Robert had never asked a question from another room unless it already carried an answer inside it. What happened? Why is that burning? Are you paying attention? Age had thinned his voice, but it had done something else too. It had taken the edge off. Or maybe David leaving had done that long before Age had the chance. "Fine," Eleanor said, "just the gravy." She rinsed the cloth, wrung it out, and stood for a moment with her hands in the sink. Behind her, the dining room waited. She told herself to go back and remove the plate before Robert saw it. There was no reason for a scene. Not that Robert made scenes anymore. That was the strange mercy of these later years. He had become careful in a way that did not always look like kindness, but often arrived in the same shape. He did not slam cabinets. He did not correct Thomas's posture. He did not tell Margaret she was making things harder than they needed to be. When Tommy spilled juice last Easter, Robert had only handed him a towel. Eleanor had watched that as if it were a magic trick performed too late. She dried her hands, returned to the dining room, and reached for the 7th plate. Robert was standing in the doorway. He had come in quietly, one hand braced against the frame. He wore the blue flannel shirt Margaret had bought him 2 Christmases ago, the one he used to say made him look like an old man from a hardware store. Now he wore it without complaint. His hair, once thick and dark and combed back with stubborn care, had gone almost white at the sides. His shoulders had narrowed. His temper had narrowed too. Or maybe it had simply run out of places to go. His eyes were on the plate. Eleanor's hand stopped halfway across the table. "I counted wrong," she said. Robert did not answer right away. That too was different. The old Robert would have filled the space quickly, not because he had something useful to say, but because silence made him feel challenged. He might have said, "Well, take it off then." He might have cleared his throat hard enough to make the room obey him. He might have pretended not to know which place setting was wrong. Now he looked at the plate as if it had been put there by someone neither of them could correct. The gravy boiled over, Eleanor added, because the quiet had become too exact. Robert nodded once. His mouth moved a little, but no words came. He looked from the plate to the chair beside it. That chair had been David's once, though no one had assigned it in any formal way. Children chose places in a family before adults understood the choice had been made. David had liked the chair because it faced the window. He could look past Robert's shoulder, past the backyard, past the maple tree that dropped leaves into the gutters every fall. Now 3 coats hung over the back of it. Robert noticed that too. Eleanor saw his fingers shift against the doorframe. He did not tell her to move the plate. He did not say David's name. He only turned his face slightly toward the living room, as if the sound from the television had called him back. "I can turn the game down," he said. It was such a small offer that Eleanor almost missed it. "No," she said, "it's fine." He nodded again, but he did not leave immediately. His eyes came back once more to the seventh plate, and for a moment Eleanor thought he might touch it. Instead, he stepped away from the doorway and went back toward the muted blue light of the television. The plate remained in her hand after she picked it up. She did not stack it with the others. She carried it to the sideboard and set it there, not hidden, not used. The doorbell rang before she could decide whether that was better or worse. Margaret came in with the kind of energy that made a house feel inspected. Her hair was pulled back neatly, her coat belted, her smile already arranged. Her husband, Lauren, followed with a foil-covered casserole dish, and Tommy squeezed past both of them, wearing a sweater with a turkey on it that looked personally offended. "Mom, it smells amazing," Margaret said, kissing Eleanor's cheek while looking past her toward the kitchen. "Do you need me to do anything? Where do you want the sweet potatoes?" "Lauren, not there. That's the dessert table." "It's not a dessert table," Eleanor said. "It becomes one every year." Margaret laughed lightly, already removing serving spoons from the drawer she had reorganized last Thanksgiving without being asked. She had always been efficient. As a girl, she had done homework at the kitchen table with her pencil lined up perfectly beside the page, as if order could keep trouble from choosing her. Now she had a job in hospital administration, 2 phones, a calendar color-coded enough to frighten Eleanor, and a son who had begun asking questions she could not schedule. Robert came in from the living room to greet them. He bent slowly to Tommy's height. "There he is," Robert said. "Big man." Tommy held up a paper hand turkey, the fingers colored red, orange, and green. "I made this at school." Robert took it with both hands. 20 years ago, he would have said something about staying inside the lines. Eleanor heard the old sentence before he did not say it. "That's a good bird," Robert said instead. "Looks mean." Tommy grinned. "It's supposed to be thankful." "Mean and thankful," Robert said. "That's a hard combination." Margaret glanced at Eleanor, pleased and a little relieved, the way they all were when Robert handled a moment gently. No one said that. No one ever said, "He would not have done that before." They only moved around the evidence of it. Thomas arrived 10 minutes later, carrying a grocery store pie and a paper bag with 2 bottles of sparkling cider. He kissed Eleanor on the cheek and gave Robert a quick hug that landed lightly, more shoulder than chest. "Traffic?" Eleanor asked. "Little bit near the bridge," Thomas said. He slipped his phone from his hand into his jacket pocket before taking off the jacket. Eleanor noticed because she was his mother and because he had always been a careful boy. Careful boys grew into careful men. They learned where to keep things. "Put your coat anywhere," Margaret said from the kitchen. Thomas looked toward the dining room. The back of David's chair was already crowded with coats. Margaret's camel wool, Lauren's dark pea coat, Tommy's puffy blue jacket with one sleeve inside out. Thomas hesitated, then laid his jacket over another chair instead. Eleanor pretended not to see. Dinner gathered itself in pieces. Robert carved the turkey with more concentration than strength. Margaret corrected Tommy twice for reaching across the table, then softened her voice the third time because Lauren gave her a look. Thomas passed dishes before anyone asked. Eleanor watched plates fill, glasses sweat, napkins fall into laps. For a little while, the house succeeded. They talked about Margaret's work, Tommy's school play, the neighbor's new fence, the grocery store changing brands of cranberry sauce. Robert asked Thomas about his apartment and did not offer advice about rent. Margaret mentioned gas prices, then the weather for the drive home, then how early stores were putting out Christmas decorations. David's name stayed outside the room. After dinner, while Eleanor was carrying plates into the kitchen, Tommy wandered back to the dining room. He had been given permission to take off his sweater if he kept his undershirt on, and now the turkey sweater hung crookedly from one arm. "Grandma," he called. Eleanor turned from the sink. "Yes, honey?" Tommy stood beside the chair with all the coats. He had one hand on the wooden back, his small fingers curled around the place where the finish had worn thin years ago. "Who sits here?" No one moved. It was not dramatic, not the way people imagined such moments. The kitchen faucet kept running. The television murmured from the other room. Margaret was scraping leftovers into a container with a blue lid. Lauren looked from Tommy to Margaret, not understanding fast enough to help. Eleanor reached for the faucet handle, but her wet fingers slipped once before she turned it off. Margaret got there first. "Oh," she said too lightly. "That was your Uncle David's chair." Tommy frowned. "I have an Uncle David?" The container lid bent in Margaret's hands. She pressed it flat. "You do," Margaret said. "He lives far away." "Where?" "Portland, last I heard." She turned toward the counter. "Mom, do you want the stuffing in the square container or the round one?" Eleanor looked at her daughter's back. There it was. The old family trick, polished smooth enough to pass as helpfulness. Answer the fact. Move the feeling. Put a lid on something. "The square one," Eleanor said. Tommy was still holding the chair. "Did he come here before?" Robert had appeared at the edge of the dining room. Eleanor had not heard him leave the living room. He stood a few feet behind Tommy, looking first at the boy's hand on the chair, then at the coats piled over it, then at the sideboard where the seventh plate still sat by itself. No one answered Tommy. Robert's face did not harden. That was what Eleanor noticed. It did not close the way it used to when David's name found its way into a room. He looked older than he had 10 minutes ago. Not angry, not even surprised. Caught. Tommy turned and saw him. "Grandpa, did Uncle David sit here?" Robert opened his mouth. Eleanor felt Margaret stop moving behind her. Thomas stood near the hallway, one hand inside his jacket pocket. His fingers closed around something Eleanor could not see. Robert looked at the chair for so long that Tommy began to swing one foot against the table leg. "Yes," Robert said at last. It came out rough, but not sharp. Tommy waited for more. Robert swallowed. His hand lifted slightly, not enough to touch the chair, only enough to show he had thought about it. He liked that seat, Robert said. The room held still around the sentence. It was not an apology. It was not enough. It did not say why David had left, or why no one had brought him back, or why a grown man in Portland still had a chair in an Ohio dining room covered with other people's coats. But it was more than Robert usually gave. Eleanor looked at her husband and, for the first time that day, felt the shape of something different under the familiar ache. Not hope, not yet. Hope was too large a word for a chair and a plate and one old man's rough sentence. But Thanksgiving had shifted. The coats were still on David's chair. The seventh plate was still on the sideboard. Tommy was still waiting for someone to explain the uncle he had only just learned he had. And Robert, who had spent 20 years avoiding the name as if it might accuse him out loud, did not walk away. Thomas's phone buzzed once inside his pocket. He did not take it out, not yet. The night David left. David Whitaker sat at the dinner table with one hand hidden under his coat and the other wrapped around a glass of milk he had not touched. He was 12 years old, though that night he looked younger to Eleanor. Smaller. His shoulders had pulled up toward his ears, and his jacket was still half on, one sleeve bunched near his elbow, as if he had meant to take it off and then forgotten how. The November dark had already pressed itself against the kitchen windows. The porch light threw a pale square onto the back steps, where a few wet leaves had stuck to the boards. "You planning to eat with your coat on?" Robert asked. His voice was not loud yet. That was the part Eleanor remembered later. Not loud at first, just flat-controlled, the way he sounded when he had already decided someone in the house was wrong and was waiting for them to admit it. David looked down at his plate. Meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans. He had always hated meatloaf, but never enough to say so when Robert was at the table. "No, sir," he said. He tried to pull his arm from the sleeve. The fabric caught at his wrist. Robert watched him struggle. "You just getting home?" David's eyes flicked once toward Eleanor. She was standing at the stove, with the serving spoon still in her hand. Margaret sat straight backed across from David, her napkin already folded in her lap. She was 15 then, old enough to understand when not to be interesting. Thomas was 7, small for his age, his fork sunk into the potatoes, while his eyes moved between everyone else. "That was at practice," David said. Robert leaned back in his chair. Eleanor turned off the burner under the gravy, though it had already been off. She set the spoon on a saucer. The house did this sometimes, tightened around a sentence before anything had happened. "Practice ended at 5, Robert said. David rubbed his thumb along the side of the glass. "Coach kept us." "Coach kept you," David nodded. Robert looked at Eleanor then, not for help, not for agreement, for witness. That was how he used to look at her when one of the children disappointed him, as if parenting required a jury and she had been seated in the front row. "Funny," Robert said, "so I talked to Coach Miller when I picked up the order from Miller's Hardware." David's thumb stopped moving. Eleanor heard Margaret take a quiet breath through her nose. Thomas lifted too much potato on his fork and let it fall back onto his plate. Robert's chair scraped the floor as he shifted forward. "He said you weren't there." David's face went still in the terrible way a child's face goes still when he realizes that the room has turned against him faster than he can think. Eleanor said, "Robert, eat first. It's getting cold." No one touched a fork. Robert did not look away from David. "Where were you?" David opened his mouth. "Not another lie," Robert said. The words hit harder than their volume. Eleanor saw David's throat move. His left hand stayed under the table, hidden inside the coat sleeve. "I was at the library," he said. "At the library?" "Yes." "Doing what?" "Homework." Robert gave a short laugh. It had no humor in it. "Homework in your practice clothes." David looked down at his shirt. The front was smudged near the collar. There was a mark on his cheek, faint but there, not dirt exactly. A scrape, maybe. Eleanor saw it then, and for 1 second, the whole room changed shape around that mark. She should have asked. She knew that later. She knew it as clearly as she knew the pattern on the old linoleum floor. The chip in the corner of David's plate, The smell of onions in the meatloaf. She should have put the spoon down, crossed the room, taken his face in her hand and asked who did that. Instead, she said, well, David, if something happened, just tell your father. David's eyes came to her again, quick and desperate. Robert heard only the part that suited him. Something did happen. He skipped practice and lied about it. I didn't skip, David said. Robert's jaw tightened. What do you call not showing up? David swallowed. I went, I just didn't go in. Margaret's fork made the smallest sound against her plate. She set it down immediately. Robert stood. Eleanor's hand closed around the back of her chair. Robert. He pointed at David, not close enough to touch him yet. You stood outside the field and then what? Walked off? Hid somewhere? David did not answer. What were you doing at the library? Drawing. The word came out so quietly, Eleanor almost hoped Robert had not heard it. He had. Drawing. David's cheeks went red. There's a table in the back. A table in the back. Robert's voice stayed measured, which made it worse. I leave work early so you can make practice. Your mother has dinner ready. Your coach expects you. And you're sitting in the back of the library drawing. I hate it, David said. The room stopped. Robert's face changed, not all at once. First the eyes, then the mouth. Eleanor had seen that look when a bill came higher than expected, when the car needed another repair, when someone at work had made him feel small, and he came home needing someone in the house to be smaller. You hate what? David had already gone too far to get back safely. Eleanor saw him understand it and keep going anyway. Football. Robert stared at him. David's voice shook. I hate it. I'm not good at it. They know I'm not good at it. They shove me into the lockers and call me... Who? David stopped. Robert stepped closer. Who shoves you? David looked down. Answer me. I don't know. You don't know their names? I do. Then say them. David's fingers tightened around the glass. It doesn't matter. Robert's hand came down on the table. Not a punch. A slap against the wood, loud enough that Thomas flinched, and Margaret's shoulders went rigid. It matters if my son lets other boys push him around. David's face folded for half a second before he forced it back. That's why I didn't go. Because you're scared. Eleanor said, Robert, stop. He turned on her. No, don't do that. Do what? Make it softer than it is. She had no answer ready. That was the problem with Robert then. He could make her feel foolish for wanting gentleness, as if gentleness were a cover for weakness, as if asking him to lower his voice meant she had chosen the child against the father. David pushed his chair back. I'm not hungry. You sit down. Sit down. David sat. Robert reached toward the coat still caught around David's wrist. And take that off at the table. David pulled back too quickly. That was when Robert saw the hand. The knuckles were red, one scraped open. Not from throwing a punch. Eleanor knew that even before David turned his palm in trying to hide it. It looked like he had fallen, or been pushed, or hit a locker and caught himself badly. Robert grabbed his wrist. Did you fight? No. Did you hit someone? No. Then what is this? David tried to pull away. Let go. The words were small, but they changed the room. Robert's grip tightened. What did you say? Eleanor moved then, only one step, not enough. Robert, his hand... I asked him a question. David's eyes had gone wet, though no tears fell. You're hurting me. Robert let go as if the words had burned him. For half a second, something like surprise crossed his face. Then shame came behind it. And because he had no place to put shame, he turned it into anger. You think this is hurting? He said. Eleanor felt the sentence before it finished. She knew. She knew and still did not move fast enough. Robert struck David across the face with his open hand. The sound was not large, that was the awful thing. It was not like in movies. It was a flat, human sound. Skin against skin, almost swallowed by the kitchen. David's head turned with it. The glass tipped over, milk spreading across the table toward Margaret's napkin. Thomas began to cry without making noise. Margaret stood so fast, her chair knocked the wall. Eleanor crossed the space then, but the crossing came after. Everything important had already happened. Robert, she said, her voice thin and wrong. Robert stared at David. David did not touch his cheek. He kept both hands in his lap, eyes fixed on the spilled milk as it reached the edge of the table and dropped onto the floor. Robert's chest rose and fell once. He looked at David's face, really looked, and the anger cracked. Eleanor saw it, a glimpse only. His son's fear had reached him, and for one breath, Robert looked like a man who had walked into a room and found himself already guilty. Then he hardened. Go wash up, he said. David did not move. Go, Robert said quieter. Eleanor put her hand on David's shoulder. Honey, go on. Your father just wants you to understand. David looked up at her. She had meant to calm him. She had meant to stop Robert from saying more. She had meant somehow to keep the dinner from becoming the thing it already was. David heard something else. He slipped from under her hand. "I understand," he said. No one answered him. He walked out of the kitchen without running. That stayed with Eleanor too. He did not slam a door. He did not shout. He walked down the hall with one sleeve still hanging loose from his coat, his scraped hand held against his side, and disappeared into the small bedroom at the back of the house. Margaret grabbed a towel and pressed it onto the spilled milk. She kept wiping the same spot after the milk was gone. Thomas cried into his potatoes. Robert stood by the table, one hand open at his side. The hand looked unfamiliar to Eleanor. Too large. Useless now. "I didn't mean," he started. Eleanor looked at him. He stopped. The kitchen did not know what to do with the unfinished sentence. Eleanor took the towel from Margaret, told Thomas to go wash his face, told Margaret to put the plates in the sink. She gave everyone a task because tasks were what she had when she did not have courage. Robert went out to the garage after dinner. Eleanor heard the door open and close. A few minutes later, she heard it again. He did not come to David's room. She did. David was sitting on the edge of his bed with his coat finally off. His cheek had gone pink where Robert's hand had landed. His sketchbook lay open beside him, but the page was blank. Eleanor stood in the doorway with an ice pack wrapped in a dish towel. "Your father shouldn't have done that," she said. David did not look at her. It was the closest she came to the truth that night, and even then she softened it before it could stand. "He's worried about you," she added. "He doesn't always know how to show it." David turned his face toward the wall. The room was small, crowded with the things he had not grown into and the things Robert kept trying to push him toward. A football helmet sat on the chair, still clean because David had barely played. On the dresser, under a stack of school papers, one corner of a drawing stuck out. A row of houses, all windows, no people. Eleanor crossed the room and set the ice pack beside him. "Put that on your cheek," she said. He did not touch it. She wanted to sit beside him, but something stopped her. The fear that he would pull away. The fear that if she comforted him too much, Robert would see it as taking sides. The fear, deeper and more shameful, that David would ask her to say plainly what she knew. So she stood. "I'll talk to him," she said. David's voice came out rough. "When?" Eleanor had no answer. From the garage came the sound of something metal being moved, then set down too hard. David gave a small nod as if she had answered after all. "Get some sleep," she said. He looked at her then. Not angry, that would have been easier. His face held a tired, watchful distance she had never seen on him before. "Okay," he said. It was the last thing he said to her in that house. Later, after Margaret and Thomas were in bed, after Robert came in from the garage, smelling of cold air and motor oil, Eleanor stood in the hallway outside David's room. The light under his door was still on. She almost knocked. Robert stood behind her. For a moment, neither of them moved. "He'll get over it," Robert said. His voice was low. It did not sound certain. Eleanor turned to him. "You scared him." Robert's face twitched. "He lied," he said. "That's not what I said." He looked toward David's door. The line of light cut across the hallway carpet. "I know what I'm doing," Robert said. But Eleanor heard the gap in it. The old certainty was there because he had dragged it up, not because it had come naturally. She wanted to say, "No, you don't." Instead, she said, "Come to bed." He stayed in the hallway after she left. In the morning, the house seemed careful with itself. Eleanor woke before 6 and lay still for a minute, listening. No shower, no footsteps, no creak from David's bed. She told herself he was sleeping hard. Children could sleep through anything when they had worn themselves out crying, though she had not heard him cry. In the kitchen, she started coffee. Robert came in wearing the same shirt from the night before, wrinkled at the elbows. He had not shaved. He opened a cabinet, closed it, then opened it again. "David up?" he asked. "Not yet." Robert nodded. He poured coffee and left it untouched. At 6:30, Eleanor walked down the hall. David's door was open. For one stupid second, she thought he was in the bathroom. The bed was made badly, the blanket pulled up but not straight. The football helmet still sat on the chair. The ice pack had melted into the towel on the nightstand. The closet door hung open. A few shirts were gone. So was the backpack. So was the sketchbook. Eleanor put one hand on the doorframe. "Did David?" The house gave back nothing. Robert came up behind her. "What?" She did not turn. He stepped past her into the room, looked at the bed, the closet, the empty place on the dresser where the sketchbook had been. His face changed faster this time. The hardness did not arrive in time to cover it. "David," he called. No answer. He crossed the room and opened the closet wider, as if a 12-year-old boy might be hiding behind the winter coats with his backpack and his drawings and his scraped hand. Then he stood very still. Eleanor looked at the bed again, at the small, uneven ridge of the blanket where David had tried to make leaving look less like leaving. Robert's hand closed around the edge of the closet door. "David," he said again, but softer now. The name did not reach the porch or the street or wherever their son had gone before daylight. It stayed in the room with the empty bed. The man Robert became. Robert said David would be back by supper. He said it while standing in David's bedroom with one hand still on the closet door, as if the room had made a mistake and he meant to correct it. The bed was empty. The backpack was gone. The sketchbook was gone. 2 shirts were missing from the drawer, and the jar of quarters Eleanor kept in the laundry room had been left with only pennies at the bottom. "He's 12, Eleanor said. Robert looked at the window, though it was shut and locked from the inside. "He's mad." "He's 12, she said again. This time Robert heard it. He turned toward her, and for a second she saw something break loose behind his face before he forced it down. His mouth tightened. His shoulders squared. It was the same shape anger had always taken on him, but the room did not obey it this time. David was not there to flinch. Margaret stood in the hall with her arms wrapped around herself. Thomas was behind her in his pajamas, one sock falling off his heel, his eyes fixed on David's unmade pillow. Robert stepped past them. "I'll check the school. It's Saturday. Then the field." Robert, he did not stop. By noon, he had driven to the football field, the middle school, the library, the gas station on Miller Road, and the diner near the bus stop. He came back once to ask Eleanor whether David had taken his winter coat, then left again before she could answer. He did not shout when he came in. He did not ask why no one had called. He moved through the house like a man still pretending he was in charge of an emergency that had already slipped past him. Eleanor called the school office and left a message. She called Coach Miller, who said he had not seen David since Thursday. She called 2 boys from David's class and listened to their mothers ask careful questions. Had David been upset? Had something happened at home? Was there a reason he would run? Eleanor gave the answers she knew how to give. He was quiet. He had been having trouble at practice. He and his father had argued. No, nothing serious. Yes, they were worried. The lie was not in the words exactly. It was in how much she left out. At 3, Robert came home with mud on his shoes and a paper cup of coffee gone cold in his hand. He stood in the kitchen without drinking it. "Anything?" Eleanor asked. He shook his head. Margaret was at the table, folding and unfolding a dish towel. Thomas sat beside her with David's football helmet in his lap, though no one had told him to touch it. Robert looked at the helmet. "Put that back." Thomas did not move fast enough. The old Robert would have barked his name. The old Robert would have made the child jump. This Robert opened his mouth, saw Thomas's small hands tighten around the helmet, and closed it again. "Please," he said. Thomas looked up. It was not the word itself. Robert had said please before. At restaurants, to clerks, to strangers. In the house with the children, please had usually been something Eleanor supplied afterward to soften what he meant. Thomas slid off the chair and carried the helmet down the hall. Robert watched him go. By evening, David had not come back. The house changed then. Not all at once. The turkey sandwiches Eleanor had made for lunch sat untouched in the refrigerator. Margaret stopped asking whether she should call anyone from school. Thomas cried after dinner because his stomach hurt, though Eleanor knew it was not his stomach. Robert sat at the kitchen table with the phone book open and his finger on a page he was not reading. "We should call the police," Eleanor said. Robert's finger stayed where it was. "He's a runaway," he said. The word sounded ugly in their kitchen. "He is our son." Robert looked at her then. His face was pale under the kitchen light. "I know what he is." Eleanor picked up the phone before he could say anything else. The officer who came was young enough that Robert treated him badly at first. Not openly. Robert had always known how to be polite when someone wore a uniform, but he answered too quickly. Corrected dates, said David was upset, not troubled, said boys that age did things for attention. The officer wrote in a small notebook. "Was there a fight last night?" he asked. Robert looked at Eleanor. It was not a plea, it was not a threat. It was worse because it was both. Eleanor wiped her hands on her apron, though they were dry. They argued. The officer waited. Robert said, "I discipline my son." The words sat between them. The officer's pen moved. "How?" Robert's jaw shifted. "I slapped him." Margaret made a small sound from the doorway. Eleanor had not known she was listening. The officer did not raise his head right away. "Did he leave after that?" "This morning," Eleanor said, "when we think before daylight." Robert looked at the floor. For the first time that day, he did not correct her. The search became practical after that. Calls, names, places, a description of David's height, his brown hair, his gray backpack, the jacket he had taken, the shoes he might be wearing, the library table where he liked to draw, the diner waitress who thought she had seen a boy like that near the vending machines. The bus station clerk who remembered a kid asking how much a ticket cost but could not swear it was him. Every question from outside the family pressed on the same bruise. Why would he leave? Was he afraid to come home? Had this happened before? Robert learned to stand still while people asked. Sometimes he answered. Sometimes Eleanor did. Sometimes neither of them said anything fast enough. And the silence answered more than they meant it to. On the third night, Robert did not come home until after midnight. Eleanor was at the table, a cup of coffee gone bitter in front of her. Margaret and Thomas had fallen asleep in the living room, curled at opposite ends of the couch as if the house had become too large for them to sleep separately. Robert came in quietly. His jacket smelled like cold air, gasoline, and rain. Where were you? Eleanor asked. The bus station. You already went there. Different shift. She looked at his shoes, wet through. Robert. He set his keys down carefully when a man said he saw a kid with a sketchbook 2 nights ago. Eleanor stood. Where? Robert shook his head. He wasn't sure. He thought maybe westbound. Maybe not. He said the boy bought a soda and sat near the lockers. Did anyone check the cameras? They don't have cameras that work. He took his cap off and held it in both hands. There was mud near the hem of his pants, a red line across his knuckles where he had scraped them on something. He looked older than he had 3 days before. Not softer exactly, stripped. He had his sketchbook? Eleanor asked. Robert nodded. It should have comforted her. That small proof of David being alive somewhere, with the thing he loved. Instead, she thought of the blank page beside his bed the night he left. Robert pulled out a chair and sat down, not at the head of the table, the chair closest to the phone. I told him drawing was a waste, he said. Eleanor did not answer. He looked at the dark window over the sink. More than once. She had known that. She had heard it. She had let it pass because Robert said things like that, and then paid for school clothes, fixed the leaky faucet, scraped ice from her windshield, worked overtime when the furnace died. She had let the useful parts of him cover the cruel parts, until the cruel parts had walked out wearing David's coat. Robert put his cap on the table. If he comes home, he said, I won't make him play. It was such a small promise against such a large absence that Eleanor had to turn away. Weeks made the house strange. The police called less often. The school sent home forms in a folder Margaret carried from the office because no one knew where else to send them. Neighbors brought casseroles, then stopped. A woman from church told Eleanor boys came home when they got hungry. Eleanor thanked her and shut the door too hard. Robert kept looking. Not loudly, not in a way that invited praise. He left early before work and drove past the bus station. He went to the library and asked the woman at the front desk whether a boy had come in to use the back table. He checked the diner until the waitress began to recognize him and put coffee in a paper cup before he asked. Once Eleanor found a folded map of Ohio and Pennsylvania in the glove compartment, marked with circles in Robert's square handwriting. Bus routes, cheap motels, shelters, towns David could have reached if he had used the quarters from the laundry room and then found help. You should have told me, she said. They were sitting in the parked car outside the grocery store. She had opened the glove compartment for coupons and found the map instead. Robert took it from her, not roughly. There wasn't anything to tell. You went all these places? Not all. When? Before work, after. She looked at him. You let me think you weren't trying. He folded the map along its old creases. I didn't want to come home with nothing every time. Eleanor almost said that nothing was what they already had. She did not. Months passed, then a year. Something in Robert changed in pieces. Not like a man becoming good. Not like the stories people told when they wanted pain to have a clean purpose. He still got impatient. He still tightened when bills came due. He still went quiet in ways that made the room watch him. But he stopped using his voice like a belt. The first time Thomas brought home a report card with a C in math, he stood beside the kitchen counter waiting for the storm. Eleanor was there, drying a mixing bowl. Robert looked at the paper, then at Thomas. What happened here? He asked. Thomas's chin began to tremble. Robert saw it. He set the report card down. Okay, he said. The word came out awkwardly as if he had borrowed it from another father. We'll figure it out. Thomas stared at him. Robert cleared his throat. After dinner, he went to the garage and stayed there for 20 minutes. When he came back, he helped Thomas with fractions until both of them were frustrated, but he did not raise his voice. Eleanor kept drying the same bowl long after it was dry. Margaret noticed too. She was older, sharper, not as willing to be grateful for a peace that had come after damage. When Robert asked where she wanted to apply for college and did not mention staying close, she narrowed her eyes. That's it, she said. Robert looked up from the newspaper. What? You're not going to tell me what makes sense? He folded the paper once. You know what makes sense. I do? I think you do. Margaret did not know what to do with that. She left the room irritated, which was better than frightened. Eleanor counted it as a mercy and hated herself a little for counting. The years did not bring David back. There were rumors, then less than rumors. A boy who looked like him in Cleveland. A youth shelter that would not confirm names. A postcard from no one, not David, though Eleanor kept it for 3 weeks because the handwriting was young and slanted. Then, when David would have been 17, a call from a woman in Oregon who ran a restaurant and said a young man named David had used their address once for mail. She would not give more. She said he was working. She said he was safe. She said he did not want contact. Robert took the call because Eleanor was outside bringing sheets in from the line. When she came in, he was still holding the receiver. What? She asked. He looked at her, and she knew before he spoke that David was alive. Portland, he said. Eleanor grabbed the back of a chair. Robert gave her the little information he had. Restaurant. Safe. Did not want contact. He said each piece like he was placing tools on a bench, one by one, because if he moved too quickly, something would cut him. Did she give a number? Eleanor asked. No. An address? No. Did you ask? Robert looked at the phone. Did you ask? She said again. His voice dropped. She said not to. Eleanor wanted to hate him for obeying. It would have been easier if he had slammed the phone down, if he had cursed David, if he had said the boy could stay gone. Instead, he sat with the receiver in his hand long after the line had gone dead. That night, Robert wrote the first letter. Eleanor did not know it then. She found out 2 years later, looking for the tax forms in the bottom drawer of the desk. The drawer stuck, as it always did, and when she pulled hard, a stack of envelopes slid forward. No stamps, no addresses, just David written on each one in Robert's blocky hand. She did not open them at first. She stood with the drawer against her knees and listened to Robert in the yard, dragging the rake through wet leaves. Then she took the top envelope and slipped one page out. David, I don't know if this will reach you. I don't know if I have the right to send it. That was as far as she read before putting it back. Her hands shook so badly she had trouble lining the page with the fold. She closed the drawer before Robert came inside. After that, she knew where to look. Every few months, there was another envelope. Sometimes only 1 page, sometimes 3. Some written on yellow legal paper, some on the backs of old work forms. One had a coffee ring on the corner. One had been folded and unfolded so often the crease had begun to tear. Robert never mentioned them. He changed in the house, but the letters stayed in the drawer. That was the shape of him for a long time. A man who could learn not to raise his voice, who could let Thomas quit baseball without calling him soft, who could sit through Margaret disagreeing with him about politics and only rub his thumb along the edge of his glass, but who could not put a stamp on an apology. Eleanor kept the envelopes where they were. She told herself they were not hers to move. The year Thomas turned 20, he came home for Thanksgiving with a haircut Robert did not like, and a major Robert did not understand. Graphic design. David would have laughed at that, Eleanor thought, then had to sit down because the thought had come so easily. Robert looked at Thomas across the table. Can you make a living doing that? He asked. The room tightened out of habit. Thomas lowered his eyes. Robert put his fork down. I'm asking because I don't know, he said, not because I think you can't. Thomas looked up. Margaret stopped cutting her turkey. Eleanor watched Robert reach for his water glass and miss it slightly, his fingers brushing the rim before closing around it. Thomas answered him, carefully at first, then with more detail. Robert listened. He asked 2 more questions. Neither of them hurt. After dinner, Eleanor found Robert in the garage, sitting on the old stool near the workbench. The light above him hummed. A half-sealed envelope lay beside his hand. You wrote another one, she said. He did not look surprised. He reminds me of him sometimes, Robert said. Thomas? Robert nodded. Not the same, just something. Eleanor stepped inside and closed the door partway behind her. You could send it. He ran one thumb over the envelope flap. No, Robert. He said no contact. That was years ago. And I earned it. The words came out plain. No defense attached, no anger carrying them. Eleanor had waited years to hear him say something that close to the center of it, and when he finally did, it arrived while he was sitting under a bad garage light with motor oil stains on the floor. She moved closer but did not touch him. What does it say? Robert looked at the envelope. Not enough. The next morning, the envelope was gone from the workbench. Not sent. Eleanor checked the mail tray without meaning to. Later, she found it in the desk drawer with the others. The letters multiplied. David grew older in the address line without ever receiving them. Robert's handwriting changed. The first envelopes were hard-pressed, the letters deep enough to mark the page underneath. Later, they became slower, uneven, where his fingers stiffened. He bought stamps once and left them in the drawer beside the envelopes. Eleanor saw the unopened booklet, all tiny flags, waiting. The house became quieter in better ways and worse ones. Robert apologized for small things now. Not well, not easily, but he did it. He apologized to Margaret for speaking over her. He apologized to Thomas for forgetting to ask before using his truck. Once, after snapping at Eleanor about a misplaced bill, he came back 5 minutes later and said, "That wasn't about you." It was not a grand transformation. It was dishes put in the sink instead of left for her. A hand lowered before it became a point. A breath taken before a sentence. A Thanksgiving table where no one got smaller when he cleared his throat. And still David did not know. That was the cost Eleanor could not cook around. Years later, on a cold morning not long before another Thanksgiving, Eleanor opened the desk drawer to look for stamps and found a fresh envelope on top of the stack. The ink was still dark. "David, I slapped you because I was angry. Not because you needed it. Not because it made you better. I was ashamed and I made you carry it." Eleanor stopped reading. From the hallway, Robert said, "Ellie?" She slid the page back into the envelope, but not before seeing the last line at the bottom. "I am sorry I became the kind of father you had to leave." Robert appeared in the doorway. For a long moment, neither of them pretended. "You read it?" he said. "Some." He nodded once, more to himself than to her. "Are you going to send this one?" she asked. He looked at the drawer, at the stack, at all those years folded and unsent. His face had aged around the same old fear. "I don't know where," he said. It was not the whole truth. They both knew that. Thomas had ways of hearing from David now and then. Not much, not enough. But enough that a message could maybe travel if someone had the courage to ask. Eleanor waited. Robert picked up the envelope. His hand shook, barely. Then he put it back in the drawer. "I don't want to hurt him again," he said. The sentence should have made her angry. It did, a little. But under it was something she had not seen in the man who once stood over their 12-year-old son and called fear weakness. He was afraid of his own apology now. Afraid it might arrive like another demand. Afraid it might ask David to comfort him. Afraid that even sorry in his mouth could become one more thing David had to survive. Eleanor closed the drawer slowly. In the room behind them, the house was quiet. Not the old quiet, not the kind that waited for Robert's temper to choose a target. A different quiet. One made of things lowered, swallowed, learned too late. That was what David's absence had done. It had not made Robert innocent. It had not brought their son home. It had not repaired the night no one could take back. But it had changed the man at the table. The letters stayed in the drawer, the stamps stayed unopened. And every Thanksgiving, when Eleanor counted the plates, Robert watched her hands as if 1 year he might finally deserve to ask her to set out 7. Happy Thanksgiving. By the time the last serving spoon hit the sink, Eleanor had almost convinced herself the family had made it through the worst part of the day. Almost. The table was a mess in the ordinary Thanksgiving way. Gravy drying at the edge of a plate, cranberry sauce smeared red across a napkin, Tommy's fork abandoned under his chair. Margaret had already begun sorting leftovers into containers before anyone had asked her to. Lauren was trying to help, but he kept reaching for the wrong lids. Robert sat at the dining room table with both hands around his coffee mug, not drinking from it. David's chair still held the coats. No one had moved them after Tommy's question. Eleanor had noticed that too. They had all found reasons not to touch that chair, as if the coats had become evidence and moving them would require someone to say what they were evidence of. "Mom, do you want turkey separated or mixed?" Margaret asked. "Separated," Eleanor said. "You'll never eat it all that way." "I know what I'll eat." Margaret looked up, heard the edge in her mother's voice, and lowered her eyes back to the counter. She pressed a lid onto a container with both palms until one corner snapped tight. The old habit tried to return. That was what Eleanor felt moving through the kitchen. Not peace. Habit. Give everyone a task. Wrap the food, rinse the plates, praise the pie. Send people home before the room asks for too much. Thomas stood near the sink, sleeves rolled to his elbows, scraping plates without looking at anyone for long. He had been quiet through dessert. Quieter than usual, even for Thomas. His phone lay face down on the small side table near the hallway, where he had put it before dinner as if it were just another object he did not need. Then it buzzed, once. A small sound, hardly enough to interrupt a holiday. Not a ring, not a call, just a short vibration against wood. Thomas's hand stopped over the trash can. Eleanor turned from the sink. No one else seemed to notice at first. Margaret was labeling a lid with masking tape because she had decided 2 years ago that Eleanor's freezer needed a system. Lauren was telling Tommy not to drag the throw pillow across the floor. Robert's gaze stayed on the coffee mug. The phone buzzed again. Thomas wiped his hand on a dish towel, too slowly. He crossed to the side table and picked up the phone, keeping his body angled away from the room. Eleanor watched the back of his neck. It had gone still. He read the screen. He did not put the phone down. "Thomas," Eleanor said. He looked up as if she had caught him doing something wrong. "It's nothing," he said. Margaret spoke from the counter without turning. "If it's work, tell them it's Thanksgiving." "It's not work." That made Robert look up. Eleanor dried her hands on the towel hanging from the oven door. She did not walk toward Thomas. Some questions scattered if approached too quickly. "Is everything okay?" she asked. Thomas looked at the phone again. His thumb moved once, not typing, just touching the edge of the screen. He had always done that when he was deciding whether to say something. Even as a boy, he had touched things before speaking. The seam of his shirt, the corner of a book, the edge of his plate. "Tom," Eleanor said, softer this time. He glanced toward Robert. That was when the room understood there was a reason to be quiet. Margaret set down the marker. Lauren's hand rested on Tommy's shoulder, though Tommy had not moved. Robert put his mug on the table. The bottom made a dull sound against the wood. Thomas slipped the phone halfway into his pocket, then took it out again. "It's David," he said. The name did not enter the room loudly. It came in plain and low, almost practical, and still Eleanor felt it pass through everyone there. Margaret's face changed first, not dramatically. Her mouth tightened, then released. She looked at the containers, then at Thomas, as if deciding whether food was still a safe subject. Robert did not move. Eleanor held the towel with both hands. "What did he say?" she asked. Thomas looked at the screen. "Happy Thanksgiving." No one answered. The faucet dripped once into the sink. Somewhere in the living room, the television crowd cheered for a play no one was watching. Tommy looked from adult to adult, puzzled by the way two words had stopped a room more completely than a shout. Eleanor had imagined, in ways she rarely admitted, what it might be like to hear from David. Not because she expected it. Expectation was too active, but sometimes, while folding sheets or buying apples or passing the bus station on errands, she would catch herself arranging the impossible into little scenes. A phone call, a letter, a knock at the door. In none of them had he said only two words. "Happy Thanksgiving." It was both too little and too much. "Is he?" Margaret began, then stopped. Eleanor looked at her daughter. Margaret picked up the container she had already sealed, found nothing to do with it, and put it back down. "Is he doing okay?" Thomas nodded, but not right away. "I think so." "You think so?" Margaret asked. "We don't talk like that." The sentence landed badly, not cruelly, just exactly. Robert's hand shifted on the table. His fingers curled, then opened. Eleanor saw the effort it took him not to ask the wrong question. In the old days, Robert's first instinct would have been to reach for control. "Where is he? What number is that? Why didn't you tell us? How long has this been going on?" Questions that sounded like concern, but carried a demand underneath. He asked none of them. Margaret tried to pick up the marker again. "Well," she said too briskly, that's nice, isn't it? I mean, it's good that he—" "Margaret," Eleanor said. Her daughter stopped. Eleanor had not meant to say it sharply. She had only meant not yet. Not the lid, not the label, not the ordinary thing pressed over the open thing. Robert pushed his chair back. The scrape was soft, everyone still heard it. He stood, then seemed unsure what standing had committed him to. His eyes were on Thomas, but not in the way they used to be. Not pinning him down, not asking him to surrender information. He looked like a man approaching a dog that had once been struck by someone else and might still bite. "Is he healthy?" Robert asked. The words came out rough. Thomas did not answer immediately. Eleanor looked at Robert. It was the question, yeah, but more than the question. It was the way he asked it. No command in it. No old authority. He did not ask why David had written to Thomas and not to them. He did not ask what David had said about him. He did not ask for the phone. Just that. Is he healthy? Thomas seemed to hear the difference too. His guarded expression did not leave, but something in it loosened. "Yeah," he said, "as far as I know." Robert nodded once. His hand went to the back of the chair beside him, then let go before fully gripping it. "Good." The word was plain, too plain for what it had to carry. Margaret looked at him then, really looked. Eleanor saw her daughter's confusion, the old reflex preparing for a version of Robert that did not arrive. Margaret had grown up bracing for his temper even after he stopped giving it to her. She still knew where to place her shoulders when the room tightened. But Robert only stood beside the table, older than all of them and smaller somehow, waiting for whatever Thomas was willing to say. "Where is he?" Eleanor asked. She kept her voice even. A mother's voice, she hoped, not a searchlight. Thomas looked at the phone again, though Eleanor suspected he already knew. Portland, he said. Margaret's eyes moved toward Eleanor. Oregon? Thomas nodded. Robert sat down. Not heavily, not collapsing. He simply lowered himself into the chair, as if the word had reached his knees before the rest of him. Portland. A real place. Not the blur of westbound. Not a rumor from a bus station. Not a woman on a phone saying safe but no contact. A city with streets and rent and rainy mornings and restaurants that needed people to wash glasses, chop onions, carry plates to tables. What does he do there? Eleanor asked. He works in a restaurant. What kind? Thomas hesitated. I don't know. Casual place, I think. He said once they do breakfast all day. Tommy brightened, relieved to understand at least one thing. Pancakes? A small sound came from Lauren. Almost a laugh, but he swallowed it when no one joined. Thomas glanced at Tommy when probably. Robert looked at the tablecloth. Does he cook? He asked. The question startled Eleanor more than the first one. Thomas shook his head. I think he manages the front sometimes, covers shifts. He's been there a while. Robert nodded again. Eleanor tried to picture David at 32, moving through a restaurant in Portland. She could not make his face stay grown. It kept sliding back to 12, the hair falling over his forehead, the narrow shoulders, the scraped hand hidden under a coat sleeve. Does he draw? She asked. Thomas looked down at the phone. The room changed around that question. I don't know, he said. It was not a lie. It was worse because it might be true. Robert closed his eyes for a second. When he opened them, he did not look at Eleanor. He looked at Thomas. How long? He asked. Thomas's jaw tightened. Robert caught it. I'm not asking to be angry. Thomas's eyes flicked up. Robert swallowed. I'm asking because I should know what I don't know. Margaret's face shifted again. Eleanor saw it this time. The surprise, the unwillingness to trust it too quickly. The old daughter measuring the new father against the old one and finding the math did not come out clean. Thomas slipped the phone fully into his pocket. Couple years, he said. Eleanor gripped the towel. Years, Margaret said. Thomas turned toward her. Not like that. Not all the time. He messaged me once after Aunt Carol died. I don't know how he found out. Then maybe once or twice a year. You never said, Margaret said. No. Why? Thomas gave her a look that had too many answers in it. Margaret picked up the marker again, then put it down without using it. Robert nodded, but the nod was not agreement. It was acceptance of a bill coming due. That was fair, he said. No one seemed to know what he meant. Thomas did. His face changed. Robert looked at the sideboard. The 7th plate still sat there, unused. Eleanor had forgotten to put it away. He had a right to someone in this house who didn't report back to me, Robert said. It was the closest he had come all day to naming the old house. The old rules, the old fear. Margaret turned away, not fully, just enough to hide whatever had crossed her face. Tommy tugged at Lauren's sleeve and whispered too loudly, Am I in trouble? No, buddy, Lauren said. You're okay. The ordinary tenderness of that almost undid Eleanor. Thomas stood with one hand in his pocket around the phone. I didn't know if I should say anything today. Eleanor looked at him. I'm glad you did. I didn't really. You did enough. Robert shifted in his chair. Did he ask about us? There it was. Not the wrong question exactly. Not the safe one either. Thomas looked at Eleanor first, then at Robert. He asked if everyone was there, he said. Margaret inhaled. Eleanor felt the towel twist between her hands. Robert's face went still. Everyone. Thomas nodded. And what did you say? Robert asked. I said yes. Tommy looked from Thomas to Robert. But Uncle David isn't here. No one corrected him. The sentence hung there. Simple and terrible, because a child had counted better than the adults. Robert's hands moved to the edge of the table. For a second, Eleanor thought he might stand again. Instead, he bowed his head and sat with the question he had not been asked. When he lifted his face, his eyes were damp, though nothing fell. Can you tell him? He stopped. Thomas waited. Robert rubbed one hand over his mouth. No, don't tell him anything for me. Not like that. Eleanor watched him fight the old shape of wanting. Wanting news. Wanting access. Wanting to use Thomas as a door because he could not bear standing outside. He did not do it. He pushed himself up from the chair and picked up 2 plates from the table, though they were already mostly cleared. He carried them to the sink. One had a smear of cranberry sauce. The other held a half-eaten roll. At the sink, he set them down too carefully. Then he turned back to Thomas. After everybody leaves, he said, would you sit with me a minute? Thomas did not answer right away. Margaret looked between them. Eleanor did not move. Robert added, only if you're willing. That was new too. Thomas's hand stayed in his pocket. Okay, he said. Robert nodded once, as if he had been given more than he deserved. The room began to move again in small pieces. Lauren guided Tommy toward the living room. Margaret returned to the containers, slower now, no longer labeling them. Eleanor picked up the towel she had twisted out of shape and folded it over the oven handle. Thomas did not take out his phone again. Robert stayed by the sink looking at the plates he had carried there. A few minutes later, when Margaret asked whether anyone wanted pie boxed up, no one answered right away. The old pattern tried to return and could not quite find its footing. David had sent 2 words. The house had found a door inside them. Later, after the pie was wrapped, after Tommy had been coaxed back into his coat, after Margaret hugged Eleanor a little too hard and Robert a little too carefully, the front door closed on the last of the Thanksgiving noise. The house settled. Thomas stood in the dining room with his jacket over one arm. Robert did not sit at the head of the table. He took the chair beside David's, the one with a clear view of the sideboard and the unused plate. Eleanor stayed in the kitchen doorway. For once, Robert did not ask her to leave and did not ask her to stay. He looked at Thomas's pocket, then at his son's face. "Does he ever get mail?" Robert asked. Thomas's fingers tightened around the jacket. "What kind of mail?" Robert looked down at his hands. "The kind a man should have sent a long time ago," he said. "The apology he never sent." Eleanor found Robert in the small room off the hallway with an envelope in his hand and the desk drawer open. He did not hear her at first. The house had gone quiet after Thomas left the dining room to get a glass of water, after Margaret took Tommy's forgotten paper turkey from the coffee table and set it near the front door, after the last of Thanksgiving had settled into dishes, foil, and tired chairs. Robert sat under the green-shaded desk lamp with his shoulders rounded forward, one thumb moving along the edge of the envelope until the paper had begun to soften. The envelope was old, cream-colored once, now yellow at the corners. David was written on the front in Robert's blocky hand. Eleanor stayed in the doorway. For years, she had known about the letters. Not because Robert had told her. He had never told her. She knew because she had lived in that house long enough to know which drawers stuck, which floorboards gave a warning, which silences meant a thing had been hidden where it could still be found. Robert held the envelope as if it were breakable. "Were you going to put it back again?" she asked. He looked up. For a second, his face closed by habit. Not anger, not anymore. Just the old impulse to protect whatever hurt before anyone could touch it. Then he looked down at the envelope. "I don't know." Eleanor came into the room. The desk was crowded with the familiar small things of Robert's later years. A jar of reading glasses, 2 pencils sharpened down too far, a stack of old hardware receipts he no longer needed but still kept, a small flashlight with weak batteries. The open drawer held more envelopes than she remembered. Some were thick, some thin, some had David's name only. One had an address crossed out so heavily the paper had almost torn. Eleanor put one hand on the back of the chair across from him. "How many?" she asked. Robert's eyes moved toward the drawer but did not count. "I stopped counting." "That's not an answer." "No." The word came out tired. Eleanor reached into the drawer and lifted the stack. Robert's hand moved, then stopped before touching hers. She set the envelopes on the desk between them. The pile looked wrong in the lamplight. Too ordinary for what it held. Years of paper. Years of not sending. Years of apology folded into rectangles and kept where only dust could answer. Robert watched her square the edges. "You shouldn't have to see those," he said. "I have seen them." His eyes came to hers. "Not all," she said. "Enough." He leaned back slightly as if the chair had given way under him. "How long?" "A long time?" He looked at the envelopes again. There was no accusation in his face, but there was something almost worse. Relief, maybe, and shame tangled so tightly they could not be separated. "I thought if I wrote it," he said, "I might send it." Eleanor pulled the chair out and sat. The room was small enough that their knees nearly touched under the desk. She could hear the refrigerator humming down the hall, Thomas setting a glass in the kitchen sink, Margaret speaking softly to Lauren on the phone near the front room. Normal sounds. A family staying careful around a door that had opened too wide. "And then?" Eleanor asked. Robert rubbed both hands over his face. "Then I'd read it." "What was wrong with it?" "All of it." Eleanor looked at the top envelope. The flap had been sealed, then opened again with a knife. "All of it?" I sounded like I wanted him to understand me. "That may be true. I don't want him to understand me." Eleanor waited. Robert's hand dropped to the desk. Not first. That was the closest he had come to saying what the letters had never managed to carry cleanly. Eleanor felt it land, and with it came a small anger she had not expected. Not the kind that wanted to punish him. The kind that had waited too long beside him while he became a better man in the house and still left David outside it. She pushed the letters closer to him. "You don't get to hide behind them anymore." Robert looked at the stack. "I'm not hiding." "You are." He started to answer, then stopped. Good, Eleanor thought, and hated how hard that word felt. She had spent so much of her life making rooms survivable, turning the heat down under boiling things. moving sharp objects out of the way, telling the children their father had not meant it that way, then telling herself the same thing until the sentence became a habit. But David's name had been spoken at the table that day. David had written Happy Thanksgiving. Robert had asked if he was healthy. The old ways had no place left to stand. Robert picked up one envelope from the middle of the pile. It had no date, but Eleanor knew it was old from the pressure of his handwriting. "This one," he said, "I wrote after Thomas graduated college." He turned it in his hands. "I thought maybe if I told David his brother did well, He did not finish. He'd what? Robert gave a short breath through his nose. Care. He probably would have. That would have been cruel. Eleanor did not soften her face. Robert put the envelope down. To tell him about a family event like he was a relative we forgot to invite. From the hallway, a floorboard creaked. Thomas stood just outside the room. He had the glass of water in his hand. His eyes were on the desk, on the envelopes, on his brother's name, repeated in their father's handwriting. Eleanor turned in her chair. "Oh, Thomas?" "I'm sorry," he said. I wasn't trying to... It's all right." He did not come in. Robert looked at him with the old instinct to dismiss a witness and the new effort not to. Eleanor saw both cross his face. For once, the effort won. "You can come in," Robert said, "if you want." Thomas stepped into the room but stayed near the wall, water glass held against his chest. "Are those for David?" he asked. Robert nodded. "All of them?" "Most." Thomas looked at the drawer. "Most?" Robert's mouth tightened. "Some I threw out." The answer seemed to disturb Thomas more than the pile. "Why?" "Because they were bad." "Bad how?" Robert looked at Eleanor, then back at Thomas. "Because I was still trying to make myself look better." Thomas absorbed that in silence. Eleanor saw the guardedness settle into him, the careful son, the brother who had kept one thin line open because everyone else had made the larger bridge unsafe. He was not 7 anymore. He was a man standing in his parents' small office after Thanksgiving, being asked without words to carry something that could hurt David. Robert seemed to understand it too. "I won't ask you to send anything he doesn't want," he said. Thomas's jaw moved slightly. "You already asked if he gets mail." "I did. And if I say no, then no." Thomas looked at him for a long moment. "You mean that?" Robert's eyes did not leave his. "Yes." Eleanor felt her own breath slow. There had been years when Robert would have taken Thomas's hesitation as disobedience. Years when a question like, "You mean that?" would have sharpened the room. Now Robert sat with it. Thomas set the water on the desk because there was nowhere else to put it. The glass left a ring near one of the envelopes. "David won't want a long letter," he said. Robert looked down at the stack. "No," Thomas said more firmly. "I mean it. If you send him 5 pages about how sorry you are and how hard it was for you, he'll read 2 lines and stop." Robert took that without flinching, but Eleanor saw the pain move through his fingers. They curled once against his knee. "I know." "I don't think you do." Robert nodded slowly. "Then tell me." Thomas gave a humorless little breath. "I can't tell you how to fix it. I'm not asking you to." "You kind of are." The room held the sentence. Margaret appeared in the hallway behind Thomas, drawn by the change in his voice. She did not enter. She looked at the letters, then at Eleanor. For once, her face had no plan in it. Robert looked at his youngest son. "You're right." Thomas seemed unprepared for that. Robert pushed the envelopes away from himself. "I don't want you to fix what I did. I don't want you to talk him into anything. I don't want you to put in a good word for me." His voice roughened, and he stopped until it steadied. "I want to ask if he would be willing to hear an apology, that's all." Thomas crossed his arms. "What kind of apology?" Eleanor watched Robert. This was where he could still fail. Not by shouting. That man was gone, or mostly gone. He could fail by reaching for the softer wrong thing. By saying he had loved David all along. By saying he was young. By saying he did not know how to parent a boy like him. All true enough, maybe, and all useless if placed before the wound. Robert looked at the envelopes. "I don't know how to do it without making it worse." Eleanor leaned forward. "Start by not making it about how hard it is for you." His eyes lifted to hers. She did not look away. "David doesn't need a perfect letter," she said. "He needed the truth when he was 12. He still needs it now." Robert swallowed. Margaret came into the room then, just far enough to stand beside Thomas. "Mom's right." Eleanor almost turned to her. Margaret rarely entered a hard moment unless she could organize it. This time she had no container, no label, no clean way to help. "He doesn't need to hear that you missed him," Margaret said to Robert. "Not first." Robert nodded once. Thomas looked at his sister. Something passed between them, old and quiet. Robert took one of the blank notepads from the corner of the desk. His hand hovered over a pencil. "No," Thomas said. Robert looked up. "Not a letter." Eleanor saw Robert's fingers tense. Thomas pulled his phone from his pocket. "A message, short. I can send it, but I want to read it first." Robert looked at the phone as if it were a door with no handle. "That's fair," he said. Thomas opened a blank text, but he did not start typing. He set the phone on the desk, screen facing Robert. The pressure in the room changed. Paper had allowed Robert privacy. Drafts, crossouts, years of deciding not to send. The phone did not. The blinking cursor waited in a box too small for hiding. Robert stared at it. Eleanor could hear the old clock in the living room. She had never liked that clock, too loud for such a small house, but Robert had fixed it twice when she suggested replacing it. Now each tick seemed to ask for a word. Robert picked up the phone, then set it down. Thomas did not reach for it. "You can say it out loud first," Eleanor said. Robert rubbed the side of his thumb along the desk edge. "I want to talk to you," he began. Thomas shook his head. Robert stopped. "That sounds like you want something," Thomas said. Robert nodded. "Right." He tried again. "I've been thinking about what happened." Margaret's mouth tightened. "That sounds like you're about to explain." Robert closed his eyes briefly. Eleanor felt a strange tenderness for him then, unwelcome but real. Not because he deserved ease, because he was finally trying to learn a language everyone else had needed him to speak years ago, and no one in the room was willing to let him translate it back into pride. He opened his eyes. "If he's willing," Robert said slowly, "I would like to apologize." Thomas did not type yet. Robert looked at him. "Not explain, apologize." Thomas's thumb moved over the screen. Eleanor watched the words appear. "If you are willing, Dad would like to apologize. Not explain, apologize." Thomas paused. Robert leaned forward slightly. "No." Thomas looked up. "Don't say Dad." The word sat there. Margaret blinked. Robert's face tightened, but he went on. "He may not call me that." Thomas looked at the screen, then deleted the word. "If you are willing, Robert would like to apologize. Not explain, apologize." The message looked colder, more formal, more respectful too, maybe. Eleanor could not tell. David would tell if he answered. Thomas read it aloud. Robert listened. "That's not enough," Robert said. Eleanor's heart pinched. She thought he meant to add more, to open the old drawer wider. But he said, "It should say he doesn't have to answer." Thomas nodded and typed. "If you are willing, Robert would like to apologize. Not explain, apologize. You do not have to answer." Robert looked at it. "And not tonight," he said. "He doesn't have to do anything tonight. Not tonight, not ever if you do not want to." The room went very still. Robert looked at the screen for a long time. Then he shook his head. "That last part," he said. "Leave it." Thomas's eyes flicked to him. Robert's voice dropped. "He should know I mean it." Thomas read the whole message again. "If you are willing, Robert would like to apologize. Not explain. Apologize. You do not have to answer. Not tonight. Not ever if you do not want to." No one spoke after that. Eleanor looked at the envelopes on the desk. All those careful failures. She thought of David at 12, waiting for someone to come after him with the right words. She thought of Robert at bus stations, at libraries, at the garage workbench, at this desk, writing and not sending, because fear could look so much like restraint when a person wanted it to. Thomas held the phone in both hands. "I need to say it's from me," he said. Robert nodded. Thomas typed above the message. "David, I'm sending this because I think you should get to decide. You don't have to protect me from your answer." He read that part aloud, and Eleanor saw Robert bow his head. Thomas waited. Robert said, "Send it." No one moved. Thomas's thumb hovered above the screen. Margaret turned her face toward the doorway, but she did not leave. Eleanor put one hand on the edge of the desk. The envelopes were close enough that her fingers touched the top one, the old paper smooth under her skin. Thomas pressed send. The message disappeared upward into the thread. For a few seconds, everyone looked at the screen as if a reply might come from the act itself. Nothing did. Only the sent message, small and final, resting under whatever David had last allowed his brother to know. Robert pushed back from the desk. He did not stand. He only moved enough to put a little distance between himself and the phone. "Thank you," he said to Thomas. Thomas slipped the phone into his pocket. "I don't know what he'll do." "I know. He might be angry." Robert nodded. "He might not answer." "I know." Thomas looked at him, testing for the old man behind the new one. Robert did not defend himself. The clock in the living room ticked on. Eleanor gathered the envelopes. Robert watched but did not stop her. She did not put them back in the drawer. She set them in a neat stack on top of the desk, where anyone walking by could see David's name. Robert looked at the stack, then at her. "They don't go back?" he asked. "No," Eleanor said. He accepted that. In the hallway, Margaret wiped under one eye with the back of her hand and pretended she had not. Thomas stood with his phone in his pocket, carrying all of them again, but not in the same way. The house waited. This time, it was not waiting for someone to stop the truth. It was waiting for David. The call. Thomas got the answer while Eleanor was washing the pie plates. He had stayed after everyone else left, not because anyone asked him to, but because no one knew how to let him go. The house had the worn-out feeling it always had after Thanksgiving. Chairs pushed back at uneven angles, serving dishes soaking in the sink, the smell of turkey still clinging to the curtains. Margaret and Lauren had taken Tommy home before he could get tired enough to ask more questions. Robert had not turned the television back on. For almost an hour, Thomas's phone had sat face down on the dining room table. Robert had sent nothing himself. That had been Thomas's rule, and Robert had accepted it without argument. Thomas had typed the message while Robert sat beside him, hands folded so tightly Eleanor could see the pressure in his knuckles. My dad wants to apologize, not explain, not ask for anything, only apologize if you are willing to hear it. Thomas had read the message out loud before sending it. Robert had nodded once. Then they had waited. Waiting changed the house. It made every small sound rude, the faucet running, a fork shifting in the sink, the heat clicking on. Eleanor kept finding things to rinse that were already clean. When the phone finally buzzed, no one moved at first. Thomas looked at it. Robert did not. Eleanor turned off the water and dried her hands on a towel, taking more time than she needed. She watched Thomas pick up the phone and read. His face did not soften exactly. It opened a little. He said he'll call, Thomas said. Robert's head lifted. Thomas swallowed. Tomorrow, 7 his time, 10 here. Eleanor gripped the towel. Robert looked down at the table. That's late for you. It was the wrong thing and not the wrong thing. A father's habit, reaching for practical concern because the real thing was too large. Thomas kept reading. He said he'll listen, but if it turns into reasons, he's hanging up. Robert nodded before Thomas finished. Good, he said. Thomas looked at him then. He means it. I know. No, Dad, I mean, he really means it. Robert's mouth tightened, but not with anger. He should. Eleanor leaned one hip against the counter. For a moment, she could not feel her age. She felt 30 years old and 69 at the same time, a young mother in a kitchen and an old woman holding a damp towel, both of them waiting for the same boy to decide whether the house could be trusted for one call. Tomorrow, she said. Thomas nodded. Robert stood slowly as if the chair had grown around him. Then we don't crowd him. No one answered. He looked at Thomas. You tell me where to sit. That did something to Thomas. Eleanor saw it in his face, the small shock of being asked instead of instructed. Kitchen table, Thomas said after a moment. Not the dining room. Robert glanced toward David's chair. No, Thomas added, not there. Robert accepted that too. The next day, Eleanor moved through the house with a carefulness that felt almost foolish. She did not make a large dinner. She did not set the table. She did not take out the good plates. She made coffee no one drank and placed 4 mugs on the counter, then put one back because David would not be in the room to use it. Margaret came alone at 9:30. She entered quietly, without her usual rush of instructions. No casserole, no child, no purse full of things to organize. Her coat was buttoned wrong at the top. I left Tommy with Lauren, she said. I told him Grandma was tired. Eleanor nodded. That was good. Margaret looked toward the kitchen. Has he called? Not yet. Thomas arrived 5 minutes before 10. He kept his jacket on, as if leaving quickly remained an option. Robert was already sitting at the kitchen table. Not at the head. Thomas had put him along the side, near the wall where he could be seen but not loom over the screen. The laptop sat in the center of the table. Robert had shaved. Eleanor noticed the small cut under his chin where his hand must have slipped. He wore a clean shirt, but not a dress shirt. No performance. No attempt to look like a better father than he had been. 59. Thomas placed his phone beside the laptop. If he changes his mind, Thomas said, we let him. Robert nodded. Margaret stood near the stove, arms crossed, then uncrossed them when she saw Eleanor looking. She picked up a dish towel and folded it once, badly. The call came at 10:01. Thomas clicked the button. For 1 second, the screen stayed dark. Then David appeared. Eleanor forgot, for the length of one breath, that grown children grew. He was not 12. Of course he was not. He had a man's face now, leaner than Robert's, softer around the mouth than Eleanor expected. His hair was longer than it had been as a boy, pushed back carelessly, and he wore a dark restaurant t-shirt under an open flannel. Behind him was a small kitchen, one cabinet door that did not quite close, a refrigerator with a paper schedule clipped to it. He looked at Thomas first. Hey, David said. His voice was lower. That was the first new hurt. Eleanor had not heard it change. Hey, Thomas said. David's eyes moved across the screen. Thomas had angled it so everyone was visible. Eleanor saw the exact second David found Robert. Nothing dramatic happened. He did not flinch. He did not glare. He became still. "David," Eleanor said. His gaze came to her. For a moment, his mouth shifted, almost the shape of her name. Then he said, "Hi, Mom." Margaret made a small sound and turned her face toward the stove. Robert did not speak. That was good. Eleanor knew it without anyone telling her. Let David arrive. Let him decide whether the room was safe enough to stay in. Thomas pulled out the chair beside the laptop but did not sit. "You can hang up whenever you want." David gave a short nod. "I know." The silence that followed was not empty. It had work in it. Robert placed both hands flat on the table. Eleanor saw him almost fold them, almost grip them, then stop himself. "David," he said. David looked at him. Robert's voice caught on the first try. He cleared his throat once, softly. "I wrote down what I wanted to say." David's face closed by a fraction. Robert saw it. He pushed a folded piece of paper away from himself. "I'm not going to read it." Eleanor felt Margaret look at her. Robert kept his eyes on the screen. "I thought if I wrote it, I wouldn't mess it up. But I think reading at you would be another way of hiding." David did not answer. Robert inhaled. His fingers pressed once into the table. "I hit you," he said. The room seemed to shrink around the plainness of it. Robert continued before anyone could rescue him. "I was angry. I was ashamed. I was scared you weren't becoming the son I thought I was supposed to raise. And I called that discipline." David's jaw moved. Robert stopped himself. Eleanor saw it happen. The old sentence came toward his mouth. "I only wanted. I thought. I was trying." He closed his eyes. "No," he said. David's eyes sharpened. Robert opened his eyes again. "No, that's not what I need to say." He looked smaller than Eleanor had ever seen him, but not weak. There was a difference. Weakness would have begged. This was something harder. "I was wrong," Robert said. "I made you afraid in your own house. I made my temper the thing everybody had to walk around. I called it rules. I called it respect. It was anger. It was mine. You were a kid." David looked down. For a moment, Eleanor could see only the top of his head on the screen. One hand came up, rubbing at his mouth, then dropped out of view. Robert's voice shook, but he did not rush to fill the silence. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm sorry I hit you. I'm sorry I made you feel weak for being scared. I'm sorry I did not ask what happened to you before I decided what kind of boy you were. I'm sorry I made you leave to be safe." Margaret pressed the dish towel against her stomach. Thomas stood very still beside the table. Robert turned his head slightly, not away from David, but enough to include the room. "And I'm sorry to all of you," he said. Eleanor felt the words before she understood he meant them for her too. Robert looked at Margaret. "I made this house careful. I made you careful." Margaret's face went red and she looked down hard at the floor. He looked at Thomas. "I made you quiet." Thomas swallowed. Then Robert looked at Eleanor. "And I made your mother choose peace when she should never have had to choose between peace and her child." Eleanor's eyes burned. She did not wipe them. Robert turned back to the screen. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," he said to David. "I'm not asking you to come home. I'm not asking you to make me feel better about what I did. I just needed you to hear from me that it was not your fault." David stayed looking down for so long, Eleanor thought the screen had frozen. Then he lifted his face. His eyes were wet, but his voice was steady enough to hurt. "I waited for you to say that when I was 12. Robert nodded, and "I know." "No," David said, not loudly. "You don't. You know now. You didn't know then." Robert took that without flinching. "You're right," he said. David looked away from the screen toward something in his own apartment. A kettle, a wall, a window Eleanor could not see. "I thought if I left for a couple days," David said, "someone would come find me and say it. Not even all of it, just something." Eleanor put a hand over her mouth. David's eyes came to her. She lowered her hand. "I'm sorry," she said. The words were too small. They were also the only place to start. David watched her. Eleanor forced herself not to reach toward the screen. "I saw you were scared. I saw more than I admitted. And I tried to keep the house calm instead of keeping you safe." Robert lowered his head. Eleanor went on before she lost nerve. "I told myself I was protecting the family. But you were part of the family. You were a child. And I let you think you were alone." David blinked once. Margaret made a soft, broken sound. "David." He turned slightly toward her on the screen. She tried to speak, failed, and shook her head. For once, no sentence came ready for her. Thomas sat down then, not beside Robert, not beside Eleanor, but close enough to the laptop that David could see him clearly. "I should have said something before," Thomas said. David's mouth curved faintly, not quite a smile. "You were 7. I know. That's not on you." Thomas nodded, but the nod did not fully accept it. No one spoke for a while. The call did not become easy. That was what made it feel real. Eleanor had feared the wrong things. Shouting, accusation, the screen going dark. Those could have happened. Instead, they sat with words that had arrived 20 years late and had no idea where to put themselves now that they were finally in the room. David rubbed one hand over his face. "I don't know what I'm supposed to say," he said. Robert answered first. You don't have to say anything. David gave him a quick look, testing it. Robert did not add to it. That silence did more than any promise would have. David leaned back. Behind him, the refrigerator hummed. A paper schedule shifted slightly under its magnet when he moved, and Eleanor caught sight of his name written in black marker on one of the lines. Dave. Not David. Dave in a life that had gone on without them. I'm not 12 anymore, David said. No, Eleanor said. I don't know how to come back as your son. The sentence struck the room differently than anger would have. Margaret closed her eyes. Robert looked at the table. David glanced at Thomas. I can't walk in there and be that kid. I don't want you to, Robert said. David looked back at him. Robert's voice was hoarse now. I don't want you to be anything for me. David held his gaze longer this time. Eleanor could not tell whether something healed in that look. Maybe healing was the wrong measure. Maybe the first mercy was simply that David did not leave. I'm off next Monday, David said at last. No one moved. He seemed irritated by his own offer or frightened by it. He looked down, then back up. Not to come there. I'm not ready for that. That's okay, Eleanor said too quickly, then stopped. David heard the quickness. His expression softened by the smallest amount. There's a place near me, he said, a diner. It's quiet in the afternoon. If Thomas has my address, he can send it. Thomas nodded, I can. David looked at Robert. I can have a meal. One meal. Robert's face changed, but he kept his voice level. I would be grateful for that. David looked at Eleanor. You too, he said. Eleanor nodded because speech would have ruined her. Margaret let out a breath that was almost a laugh and almost crying. Can I come? David looked at her for a long second. Not the first one, he said. Margaret took it. Eleanor saw the effort in her daughter's mouth. Okay, Margaret said. David looked at the screen at all of them arranged in the kitchen that had once been too small to hold his fear and now seemed barely large enough for their relief. I'm not promising Thanksgiving, he said. Robert nodded. One meal. And if I need to leave, I leave. Yes, and no speeches. A brief sound came from Thomas. This time it was almost a real laugh. Robert's mouth moved, not smiling exactly, but close enough to show the man he had become, trying not to take more than he was given. No speeches, he said. David looked at him for one more second. Then he nodded. The call ended a few minutes later, not with a grand goodbye, but with practical things. Thomas would text the diner name. Eleanor would wait for David to choose the time. Robert would not call unless David asked. Margaret would not send a long message tonight. Everyone agreed too carefully, but they agreed. When the screen went dark, no one reached to close the laptop. The four of them stayed around the kitchen table, looking at their own faint reflections in the black glass. Robert was the first to move. He took the folded paper he had not read and held it between both hands. Eleanor thought he might put it back in the drawer with all the others. Instead, he slid it across the table to Thomas. Keep it, Robert said, in case I forget what I'm not allowed to make this about. Thomas took the paper. Margaret sat down hard in the nearest chair and covered her face with both hands. Eleanor stood behind Robert and placed one hand on his shoulder. He did not reach up to take it. He only bowed his head under the weight of it. On the dark laptop screen, the kitchen reflected back without David in it. But for the first time in 20 years, the empty space did not feel locked. One meal. David had said one meal. And no one in the room tried to turn it into more. 7 plates. Eleanor set the 7th plate down with both hands. She did not freeze over it this time. She did not reach to take it back. The plate landed softly on the old dining room table, white with a blue rim, catching the light from the fixture Robert had promised to replace for 15 years and never had. She straightened the fork beside it, then moved the water glass half an inch to the left. 7 places. Not 6 with a mistake. Not 6 with a ghost. 7. From the kitchen came the low sound of the oven fan and the slow bubble of gravy warming in a saucepan. She had made less food than she used to, and still too much. There were turkey, mashed potatoes, green beans, rolls under a towel, and one pumpkin pie she had nearly ruined by taking out too early because she kept looking at the clock. Robert stood near the doorway between the dining room and the kitchen, watching her hands. He had been doing that all morning, not correcting, not asking, just watching as if he understood that the counting belonged to her now. He said 2 o'clock, he asked. 1:30, Eleanor said. Robert looked at the clock on the wall. It's 1:16. I know. He nodded and looked toward the front hall. This was not Thanksgiving, not exactly. It was a Saturday 2 weeks after the call, gray outside, cold enough that Eleanor had turned the heat up before breakfast. David had said he could come for a meal. One meal. He had repeated that twice to Thomas, and Thomas had repeated it to everyone else with the firmness of a man carrying instructions from a boarder. No speeches. No crowding. No making Tommy perform cuteness. No asking David when he was coming back again. Margaret had not liked the last one, but not argued. She had come early anyway, without Lauren or Tommy at first, to help Eleanor peel potatoes and then complain that the peeler was dull. It had been her version of nervousness. Later, Lauren would bring Tommy closer to dinner if David said it was all right. Thomas was already there, sitting at the far end of the kitchen table with his phone beside him, not in his hand. He had received 3 texts from David that morning. On the road, stopped for gas, 15 minutes out. Each one had moved through the house without anyone saying much. Robert stepped into the dining room. Eleanor watched him look at the chair. For 20 years, that chair had held coats, shopping bags, a box of Christmas ornaments one December when Margaret had reorganized the closet, and once a stack of old newspapers Robert meant to take to recycling. Today it stood bare. Eleanor had wiped the back with a damp cloth even though it had not been dirty. Robert crossed the room slowly. He put one hand on the chair back. His fingers moved over the worn place where David's hand had once rested when he pushed himself up from dinner as a boy. Eleanor saw him feel it. She had felt it too, more than once, and pretended she was only dusting. Robert pulled the chair out from the table. Not all the way, enough. Then he stepped back. He did not stand behind it like a host. He did not angle it the way he wanted. He did not put his hand on it again. "He can move it," Robert said. Eleanor looked at him. He cleared his throat. "If he wants." "Yes," she said. Robert nodded as if that had been the answer to a question larger than furniture. A car slowed outside. No one moved. The car passed. Margaret came in from the kitchen with a dish towel over one shoulder. "That wasn't him." "I heard," Eleanor said. Margaret looked at the table and stopped. Her eyes went to the 7th plate, then to the chair pulled out slightly. She pressed her lips together. "It looks nice," she said. Eleanor almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because Margaret had found the safest possible sentence and offered it like a casserole. Thomas's phone buzzed. All 4 of them turned. He looked at the screen. "He's here." The house did not become still. Not the old way. The old stillness had waited for Robert. This one waited for the door. Eleanor wiped her hands on her apron, though they were dry. Margaret set the towel down on the sideboard. Robert took one step toward the hall, then stopped himself. Thomas went to the door. Eleanor followed as far as the edge of the dining room and no farther. She had thought she would rush. For years, if she allowed herself to imagine David at the door, she imagined crossing the distance before anyone could stop her. But now that the moment had been given to them, she understood it did not belong to her first. The front door opened. Cold air came in. Thomas said, "Hey," a pause. "Hey," David said. His voice was the same as on the call and not the same at all. In the house, it had weight. It touched the walls. David stepped inside with a dark jacket zipped halfway and a small paper bag in one hand. He looked taller than Eleanor expected, though she knew that made no sense. He was a grown man. He had a grown man's shoulders, a faint line between his brows, and the tired eyes of someone who had worked too many mornings in a restaurant and learned to notice exits without looking for them. For one second, Eleanor saw 12 and 32 at the same time. Then David looked at her. "Hi, Mom." She did not move fast. She walked to him. He let her hug him. Not tightly at first. His arms came around her after a delay so small no one else might have seen it. Eleanor felt it anyway and made herself keep the hug gentle. He smelled like cold air, coffee, and soap she did not know. "Hi, honey," she said. The word came out before she could decide whether she had the right to use it. David did not pull away. When he did step back, his eyes moved past her. Robert stood near the dining room entrance. He had not come forward. Eleanor loved him for that and hurt for him at the same time. David looked at him. "Robert." The name landed carefully, not Dad, not Sir, not nothing. Robert nodded. "David." They stood with the length of the hallway between them, both men letting the name be enough for the first moment. Margaret appeared behind Eleanor. "Hi," she said, and her voice cracked on the one syllable. David looked at her. His expression shifted into something almost amused, almost sad. "Hey, Maggie." Margaret covered her mouth. "No one calls me that anymore," she said. "I know." Thomas closed the door and looked down at the bag in David's hand. "What's that?" David glanced at it as if surprised to still be holding it. "Coffee from the place near my apartment. It's not fancy, just..." He shrugged. "I brought something." Eleanor took the bag only because he offered it. "That's good," she said. "Thank you." It was not enough. It was perfect. No one knew what to do next. That was the first kindness of the afternoon. No one pretended they did. The kitchen made ordinary demands. The rolls needed moving. The gravy needed stirring. Margaret asked whether anyone wanted water, then corrected herself and asked David if he wanted water. Thomas took the coffee into the kitchen and set it beside the pie as if it were part of the meal plan. Robert stayed out of the center of the room. David stood in the dining room and looked at the table. Eleanor watched him see the 7 plates. His face did not change much, but his hand went once to the back of the nearest chair. "Is this okay?" Eleanor asked. David looked at her. "The plate," and she said, "like the chair, all of it. And if it's too much, we can—" No, he said. Not sharply. Just enough to stop her from fixing what he had not asked her to fix. He looked at the chair that had been pulled out slightly. "Can I move it?" Robert answered before Eleanor could. "Of course." David pulled the chair a little farther from the table. It made a soft scrape against the floor. Everyone heard it. He sat. Not fully relaxed. Not like a man returning to a place that had always kept him safe. He sat carefully, one elbow near the edge of the table, his body angled a little toward the room instead of into it. But he sat. Eleanor turned toward the kitchen because her eyes had filled too quickly. She picked up the gravy ladle and forgot what she meant to do with it. Margaret took it gently from her hand. "I've got it," she said. Eleanor let her. They brought food to the table without ceremony. No one said grace. Robert did not carve because Eleanor had sliced the turkey before David arrived. That had been Thomas's suggestion. Fewer old positions. Fewer chances for the meal to arrange itself like the past. Robert sat 2 chairs away from David, not at the head. The head of the table stayed empty until Thomas put the rolls there because no one needed to own it. For the first few minutes, they passed dishes with too much care. "Potatoes?" Thomas asked. David took the bowl. "Thanks." "Green beans?" Margaret asked. "Sure." "Turkey?" Eleanor asked, then immediately wished she had waited because his plate was already too full. David glanced at the serving dish. "A little." Robert reached for it, then stopped and let Thomas pass it instead. David noticed. He said nothing. That was how the meal began. Not with ease, but with small permissions, not to repeat old shapes. After a while, Margaret asked about Portland. "Not too much, just enough." "Does it really rain all the time?" she said. David stabbed a green bean with his fork. "Not all the time. Just enough for everyone to mention it." Thomas gave a short laugh. Margaret smiled too quickly, thought, "That sounds annoying." "It is." "And the restaurant?" Eleanor asked. David looked at her, then down at his plate. "It's busy. Breakfast crowd is brutal. People get weird about eggs." Robert made a sound. Everyone looked at him. He seemed surprised by himself. "They do." David's mouth moved. Not a smile, nearer than before. "What's your egg rule?" David asked. Robert looked caught. Eleanor nearly stepped in, then did not. "My what?" "Everybody has one. Too runny, too hard, no brown edges, and whatever." Robert looked at his plate, then back at David. "I don't like them wet." Thomas laughed first. He tried to stop and made it worse. Margaret covered her mouth. Eleanor pressed her napkin to her lips. David looked at Robert, and this time the smile arrived. Small, but real. "That's a terrible way to say that." Robert blinked. Then he laughed. It was not loud. It did not fill the room the way his anger once had. It opened something. Eleanor looked down at her plate because watching them was too much. The front door opened half an hour later after Thomas went to let Lauren and Tommy in. Eleanor had been worried about this part. Children had a way of cutting straight through what adults built carefully around pain. Tommy came in carrying a drawing rolled in one hand. Margaret caught him by the shoulder before he could run into the dining room. "Remember what we talked about?" "I know," Tommy said, offended. "Don't ask too many things." David heard that and looked toward the hall. Tommy stepped in, saw him, and stopped with the sudden seriousness of a child meeting someone who had been made important before being made real. "Are you Uncle David?" he asked. David set his fork down. "I am." Tommy considered him. "I'm Tommy." "I heard. You work at a pancake place?" Thomas coughed into his napkin. David glanced at him, kind of. Tommy came closer, holding out the rolled paper. "I made this. It's not a turkey. It's a dragon. But Mom said, don't make everything about Thanksgiving." Margaret closed her eyes. David took the paper and unrolled it. The dragon had too many legs, wings like leaves, and a row of orange spikes down its back. "This is good," David said. Tommy brightened. "Really?" "Yeah, the feet are weird, but in a good way." Tommy looked relieved. "I like drawing." No one moved. It was only a child's sentence, a simple thing. But Eleanor felt the whole table hear it, the way families hear what they have once failed to protect. Robert looked at David. David looked at the drawing. Then he looked at Tommy. "Keep doing it," David said. Tommy nodded as if he had been given official permission and climbed into the chair Lauren pulled out for him. Margaret did not change the subject. That too mattered. Dinner loosened after that. Not entirely, not perfectly. There were still careful pauses. David still looked toward the hall once when Robert shifted his chair. Robert still lowered his voice too much when he asked for the salt. Eleanor still had to stop herself from serving David more food every time his plate showed space. But no one made the table smaller to fit the fear. After the pie, Robert stood to take plates to the sink. David stood too. "I can help," David said. "You don't have to," Robert answered. "I know." They carried plates together. Eleanor stayed seated. It took effort. Her whole body wanted to follow, to manage the distance between them, to soften any wrong word before it landed. Thomas touched her arm under the table. "Let them," he said quietly. So she did. At the sink, Robert rinsed a plate and handed it to David, who put it in the dishwasher the wrong way. Robert noticed. Eleanor saw him notice. He did not correct it. David saw him not correct it. For a moment, both of them stood there with a badly placed plate between them. Then David reached in and turned it slightly. "Restaurant habit," he said. Robert nodded. "Kitchen rules." Yeah. The words were ordinary. They held. When the meal was over and coats were being gathered, David did not leave right away. He stood near the dining room table, one hand resting on the back of his chair. His chair. Eleanor let herself think at once. Robert came to the doorway, but not closer. "I'm glad you came," he said. David looked at him. The room quieted, but not in fear. Robert added nothing. No plea, no next time. No attempt to make the sentence larger than David could hold. David nodded. "Me too," he said. It came slowly. It came like a man testing the weight of a bridge with one foot before trusting it with both. Eleanor saw Robert receive it and not grab for more. David put on his jacket. He hugged Thomas first, then Margaret, who cried despite herself and apologized twice until David told her to stop. Tommy asked if he could send him another drawing. David said yes, if it had fewer feet. At the door, David turned to Eleanor. "I'll text when I get home," he said. She nodded, and okay. It was such a small sentence, and it changed the shape of the evening. When the door closed behind him, no one moved to clean up. The table was still crowded with plates, crumbs, glasses, napkins folded and unfolded by nervous hands. At David's place, the chair remained pulled out from the table. No coat hung over it. Eleanor walked back into the dining room and stood where she had stood that morning. 7 plates had been used. Not one set aside, not one kept for memory. Used, marked with gravy, cranberry sauce, a streak of pie filling on the rim of David's. Robert came to stand beside her, but not too close. After a while, he reached toward the head chair, the one he had not taken all evening, and pushed it gently under the table. Eleanor looked at him. He shrugged, almost embarrassed. "Makes more room." Thomas laughed softly from the kitchen. Margaret leaned against the doorway, wiping her eyes with a napkin and pretending it was not happening. Eleanor picked up David's plate. For 20 years, she had imagined a clean miracle, a door opening, a sun restored, a family returned to the shape it had lost. This was messier than that. Better, maybe. A plate that needed washing. A chair that had been sat in. A promise only as large as a text when he got home. She carried the plate to the sink. Robert moved aside to give her room. Outside, David's car started. No one rushed to the window. No one needed to prove he had really come. At the sink, Eleanor ran warm water over the blue-rimmed plate and watched the last of the gravy loosen from the edge. She set it in the rack with the others, not apart from them. Behind her, the family began to gather the rest.